impression that for many other migrants coming from other parts of the world, including migrants who are racialized as people of color in Canada, is the influence of a very large and long historic African-American diaspora just across the border. So even though the African-American diaspora is not part of our physical geography, it's very much part of our cultural geography, if you like. The representations of popular culture are part of our popular culture too, given the dominance of American popular culture, not only in Canada, but in many parts of the world. So one of the things that migrants from Africa talk about in this context is that the migration process to Canada involves a process of learning to become black. And I've got here a quote from Awad El-Karim Ibrahim, who is describing his migration from Sudan to Canada, to Ontario originally, I think, as a retranslation of self. So he says, as a continental African, I was not considered black in Africa. Other terms served to patch together my identity, such as tall, Sudanese, and basketball player. However, as a refugee in North America, my perception of self was altered in direct response to the social processes of racism and the historical representation of blackness, whereby the antecedent signifiers became secondary to my blackness, and I retranslated myself. I became black. So just remember that as we're going through what's happening to adolescents here. This process of racialization, then, is mediated by a long history of racist discourses, practices, and representations, both in the US and in Canada, but also mediated by contemporary popular cultures of resistance, such as rap and hip-hop, that have emerged from young African-American artists. So there's both a point of resistance to these kinds of discourses of blackness, and also a point of overwhelming negative discourses. Both of these are highly gendered cultural expressions, and they have different resonances then, often, for men and women, as well as different resonances for Canadian-raised children, African-Canadian children, and their parents, who are not raised here, and don't have the same connections with local popular culture, let alone local youth culture. So in this talk today, then, I'm focusing on the second generation, and I'm including there people who were born in Canada and raised here, as well as people who came when they were children and did at least part of their schooling here. And I'm not talking about the differences between those two, although I think there probably are differences, but we're just in the middle of interviewing the second generation, so I can't tell you very much about what those differences might be. And I really am drawing both on some of the interviews we've done with adults and on focus groups done previously with teenagers, and thinking about negotiating masculinity and femininity in high schools. And I have to say that the suicide yesterday of a teenage girl is a real reminder of that, of just how oppressive that can be for almost everyone. And then when you add additional sets of things that are going on, it can become even more of a struggle. So the question I'm asking here then, how do these complex intersections of generation, racialization, and gender intersect with the migration process itself and the settlement process to shape identities among second-generation African-Canadian adolescents? So I'm thinking about how identities are formed through these interlocking relations of power and privilege. And in this case, the power relations involved in the migration process itself, involved in generational changes, in racialization processes, and in gender. Although this not very accomplished little graph, I'm not very good with PowerPoint, I have to say. I did this and then thought, well, it looks like they're all separate. I don't mean them to be separate, so pretend it doesn't look like that. I don't know what it should look like, but my PowerPoint doesn't give me something ready-made that works, so this was the closest one. Think of these as linked and integrated and simultaneously negotiated, not as separate. But the key thing here is that identity is kind of at the core of the middle of them, and identity is about negotiating across all of these things in some way simultaneously. So I want to take each one first to talk about what's involved and then talk about what I think is actually happening for teenage boys and girls in this context. So migration first. Migration is always a disruptive process, I think, for everyone, resulting in migrants having to negotiate changing cultural contexts, multiple sets of expectations, new social institutions, gender norms that may clash with the gender norms that they're used to, changes in economic circumstances, which are absolutely critical for most recent migrants in the Canadian context, as we well know, a lot of documentation on this, that downward class mobility is almost a standard story, and that itself is something that has to be negotiated. And family relationships that, as we know, can both be a source of real cohesion and power and a source of support, but can also be a source of incredible tension. And particularly when we talk about generational shifts. So generation is a critical factor because clearly the second generation navigates migration completely differently than their parents do. For those raised in Canada, negotiating not only their parents' expectations from somewhere else, but also engaging with what's going on here. And particularly in the schools as a primary focus of socialization, through peers, relations with peers, and also, I think, influences of popular culture and in particular youth culture. This all takes place in the broader context of processes of racialization that include legacies of white privilege, ongoing realities of racism, and here place is particularly important too. So the size of the African-Canadian community that I noted at the beginning, that 1%, makes a significant difference in terms of how racialization processes actually take place. And if we were looking at a city like Toronto, we might see something quite different. Because the Ghanaian population alone is bigger than the entire African-Canadian population here. Proximity to the U.S. is also essential in terms of place here. The dominance of pejorative discourses about blackness, as well as resistance through particular youth culture. Both may be embedded in U.S. experiences, but they also form part of our cultural landscape. And gender. Of course, this plays out differently for men and women because it's always gender in some way. Second-generation African-Canadian men and women navigate different gender norms, of course, from masculinity and femininity, but also different norms that are brought by their parents from countries in Africa, different norms encountered here, and then on top of that, on top of the typical gender norms that we're all navigating at 13 and 14 and 15 and how painful that can be, also gendered representations around blackness that come from popular culture as well as pressures of heteronormativity. And by that I mean assumptions that everybody is heterosexual, whether they are or not, and the kind of pressures that puts on teens particularly. And I think recognizing that the scripts of masculinity and femininity that teens especially have to encounter or are pressured to encounter in particular ways are very, very constraining. And then when you add these other dimensions onto it, it's even more constraining. So what are we talking about here then when we talk about identity? Not surprisingly, we're talking about the development of real hybrid kinds of identities. Very different from parents, and I think different from children raised locally who don't have immigrant parents as well. And these forms of hybridity are connected to traversing multiple and sometimes contradictory sets of expectations. So 4 threads that we can look at, and I don't mean these to be completely separate because they're not in any one person, they're not. And that is a really strong identity with the local homeland, or a very strong identity as Canadian, and asserting that Canadianness. On the other hand, possibly a strong identity with parents' homelands, whether that's Nigerian, Kenyan, etc., or African, more broadly. identifying as both and, the notion of African Canadian, and what that might mean for someone's identity. And then finally, an identity as black, as I quoted Ibrahim earlier, talking about this retranslation where he felt he became black, and that was the most important thing in terms of his engagement with people. We need to remember, of course, that identities are always multiple, fluid, situational, and they change over time. So I'm not even trying to get to the place where 10% think this and 40% that at all. But what I'm thinking about is what's happening at the level of adolescence in particular that leads to very different gendered identities for young men and young women. So 3 competing sets, there's one of my really lovely graphs again, sorry. I do ones that I like better at the end, so maybe you can tell me if you think they're better or not, if they're just as lame as these ones. 3 competing sets of influences then in terms of negotiating identity. So 1, the values, beliefs, and practices located within families and the local African communities. 2, mainstream Canadian culture, the assumptions that are coming through there, particularly schools and peers that I'm going to talk about. And 3, the influence of the African American diaspora. And again, these bleed into each other. They're not really separate. So one of the key tensions then that second generation youth and young adults often talk about is simultaneously being seen as neither African enough nor Canadian enough. And this is a real issue to be worked through. Not African enough because it's very hard to live up to parents' expectations, given this is a different context and different sets of pressures. And it's not uncommon in interviews with parents to have them question the Africanness of their own children. And what they're often questioning is their own parenting when they do that. Or to talk about losing their children in this context. So this is a quote from Jane, a Canadian-born woman in her mid-20s, talking about the terms that her father uses, which are clearly pejorative, to talk about her as whitewashed. She says, because I didn't have my dad around as much, like I think I missed out on a lot of the life being an African child, and I was surrounded by white people. He always says that to me too. He doesn't think I'm very like African. He thinks I've been whitewashed. Language fluency is another barometer that many people will talk about. The inability to speak either their parents' language or sometimes a language they spoke, in fact, in early childhood and no longer speak. This is a quote from Joy, a woman in her late 20s, who migrated to Canada at the age of 11 from Kenya, and explaining how she feels that she can't even claim a Kenyan identity sometimes because other people won't accept that she really is because she doesn't have the language. So it bothered me before because people who would come as an adult, they'd come and they'd be like, oh, you're from Kenya. And then they'd talk to me and I'd say, I don't understand. Like, I understand what you're saying, but I can't speak it. Then they'd be like, oh, then they'd use that to be better than me. Yeah, like, oh, you're half Kenyan or something. So it's a thing that it bothered me a lot when I grew up, and even in adulthood. So this idea of not being African enough makes it difficult then to simply claim an African, or in this case a Kenyan identity. But at the same time, many also question their Canadianness. And the questioning Canadianness is, once again, how other people perceive them. The quest to be recognized as Canadian is central to belonging, and it raises clear expectations of equal treatment within Canada for all Canadians. But as we've seen, being black in Vancouver and the realities of racism could make tenuous any straightforward claim to Canadianness because it's often disputed in often very subtle ways by other people. So Danielle, for example, a university student, again born in Metro Vancouver, who says, I sometimes felt like I wasn't part of either world, Canadian or African. And she goes on to talk about her inability to speak her parents' language that separated her from the African world, while being, and I quote again, the only black child at school or in my church made her feel like she didn't belong. And what many, both teens and adults that I've interviewed recently will talk about is this constant refrain, where are you from? in contexts where there's no particular context for the where are you from. One woman I interviewed just a few days ago said when people say that to her, she says, where are you from? And I said, so how do people respond? And she said, they say, why are you asking? And I say, why are you asking? And it's a way of disrupting this assumption that if you're black, you can't actually be from here. You've got to be from somewhere else. So these issues of Canadian enough, African enough go on. But then there's also interaction with the main social institutions of childhood and adolescence, and that's the schools. We know, of course, that public schools, private schools too for that matter, are a site of both official and hidden curricula. And the hidden curricula is just as important as the official one. Both of which I think reinforce very mainstream Canadian values and Eurocentrism, even though I know that they try hard to embrace notions of multiculturalism, but not in a way, I think, that's very deep or in fact disrupts these notions about who really belongs and who doesn't very much. In the context of African Canadian communities, some of these things that are valorized, like individualism, clash with family-centered values, this very strong discourse on children's rights, clashes with stronger desire for parental authority and discipline. And in the end, as the one youth worker I'm quoting here said, the schools criticize everything that African parents do, even if they're not aware that that's what they're doing. And that also can lead youth away from identifying with the local African communities. Equally important, school is, of course, where friendships are formed. And those friendships, given 1% of the population, are largely with other people who come from possibly all kinds of other parts of the world, or, and or Canadian raised, and maybe Canadian born as well. So the powerful influences of peers and peer networks, as well as North American youth culture, are absolutely central to the way all youth negotiate their identities. So what is it about youth culture then? Thinking about what youth culture stresses, clearly youth culture stresses adolescent autonomy from parents, normalizes early heterosexuality, glorifies a lot of high-risk activities, and I just put drugs and alcohol there, but others as well, and encourages conspicuous consumption and materialism. And these are all values that are seen to be quite antithetical to the visions that migrant parents bring with them. And it widens the cultural gap between parents and children. Now, I don't think there are parents from any cultural background who actually think these are good influences. I have a 15-year-old daughter. I can tell you I don't like most of what I see in youth culture these days, and that just tells you how old I am. But at the same time, for anyone who grew up here, we've had our own engagements with youth culture. We have a place in which to stand to understand this a lot better than does a parent coming from another part of the world that hasn't engaged with this in the same way. So, African Canadian adolescents then are negotiating masculinity and femininity, as is everybody else in the high schools and the context they're embedded in, and often getting competing and constraining sets of expectations. So normative models of what's appropriate for masculine and feminine behavior, which is constraining for everybody, but they've got 2 sets of them already, coming from Canada, coming from various African countries. Secondly, North American popular cultural stereotypes about black masculinity and femininity, which other people are not having to deal with in the same way, because these are pretty pejorative stereotypes. Thirdly, gendered forms of everyday racism that I think is really important for understanding why young men gravitate towards African American youth culture and young women don't. And I mean here especially, young men talk a lot about surveillance, really, really heavy police surveillance, public surveillance, being confronted about being on the street for no particular reason that they can comprehend. And really just going from being a cute little 10-year-old to suddenly you're a 14-year-old, look like a man, and suddenly you're a threat because you're on the street. That's really, really difficult to negotiate. For young women, it's much more about beauty norms. And the women I've interviewed have talked a lot about hair, and as a symbol of those that really oppressive kinds of beauty norms that they have no ability to negotiate in a way that's successful. And of course, hierarchies among and between boys and girls and women and men. So, given all these diverse pressures then, what I'm really trying to understand here, or to come up with a basic explanation for is, why is it that the young men or teenage boys are drawn towards African American representations? That kind of cool pose look. And the young women are not drawn there at all, and really reject associations with an African American representation. So I'm going to try to just give you an explanation for that and see whether it goes together or not. For all adolescents, learning to fit in and be accepted by peers is absolutely critical. Mediating relations with peers, we need to remember, is racialized and it's gendered. It's racialized in the context of white privilege, where the dominant notions of what appropriate masculinity and femininity are white bodies occupy those spaces for what it is that's most revered. And of course, it's gendered in the context of ongoing gender inequalities, compulsory heterosexuality, etc. So adolescent boys, then, in particular, engage in negotiating masculinity largely by finding a place amongst hierarchies with other boys. For young girls, it's quite different because they're both negotiating a place amongst girls and amongst boys. For boys, it's all about the other boys. Earning respect from other boys means learning to stand up for themselves under imminent threats, often, of aggression, which may be physical aggression or it may not be physical, but it's all about putting boys in their place within male status hierarchies. As Eddie, a high school senior, explained, you get picked on a lot. So you have to be strong for your own self, like you have to, stand up for your own self. You have to do extra work to get respect. And this has been a constant theme about doing extra work in order to get respect. But for young men, negotiating masculinity also means negotiating racialized identities. And that means all of those images that they're confronted with about what black masculinity is. And that's, from American popular culture, saturated with associations of violence, criminality, and just disreputable kind of behavior. So young men in the local African diaspora talk about learning to walk a fine line between defending themselves and earning respect, and simultaneously learning to be humble, mellow, and cautious, so that they don't, this is my better graphic, so that they don't get into trouble with authorities because of that heavy surveillance that's always there. So they are ever aware that they are young black men. So, for example, second-generation young men talk about facing frequent harassment, as I've said, by authorities, challenges of the right to occupy public space, and if altercations do occur, are frequently seen as the instigators. And these are all routine aspects of learning to live with what is, in fact, a devalued male status in the Canadian context. So, in searching for ways to fit in and gain respect then, one venue is sports. And a number of young men that we've been talking to have turned to sports, have been really good athletes, and that's been a way that they can negotiate a really positive kind of representation and space in a high school environment. But not everybody is an athlete. And for many people, that's just not possible. These experiences of the way in which racialization operates for young black men serve, I think, to heighten affinity with what they see coming out of the U.S. And therefore, embracing kind of powerful representations of streetwise black masculinity that you see as a form of resistance to African-American youth culture also becomes something that many young men as teenagers begin to adopt. Adopting the masculine swagger or cool pose valorized in rap and hip-hop, for instance, provides young black men with a form of respect from their peers, because that music also has great popularity amongst a very wide audience, even as it further divides them from their parents' notions of acceptable masculinity. So it actually drives them further away from what their parents find acceptable, and real conflicts between teen boys and fathers is one of the things that we see coming out of this quite often. Girls, can you actually read all that up there? Can I tell you what the little ones mean? I can't tell. Girls are negotiating this somewhat differently, because masculinity and femininity aren't negotiated in the same way. And although for boys, images of black masculinity coming out of African American pop culture can provide another point of reference, an alternative point of reference that they can play with performing. Nothing like that really exists for girls. Representations of black femininity in North American popular culture and in African American youth culture are both largely pejorative. They coalesce around the hypersexuality of black women and around the excessive independence and domination of women. So, or women who don't need men. Patricia Hill Collins, for any of you who have read her work on this, is really good at talking about the kind of double negative representations that black women in the United States experience. Neither of these provide a space to gain any respect from their peers. Conventional notions of beauty and attractiveness, which are central to negotiating femininity, are very much embedded in white middle-class norms about what beauty and femininity is. And as some women that I've interviewed recently have talked about, that's even true when you do have black women who are superstars. They actually don't look black. It's how, people like Beyonce, for example. So very light skin, very fine bone structures, etc. So given that these beauty ideals are really important for status hierarchies among girls and between girls and boys, it means that they have nowhere to stand that's allowing them this alternative. So representations of black femininity in African American youth culture, because it's so male-centered, doesn't provide them with an alternative. And none of the young women that we've been talking to have turned to sports either, although some might. But I think there's a very mixed message in terms of sports for women generally. As you know, too much sports is actually not all that bad. So it may not be the same space that they can stand to. So where have girls gone? What we hear a lot of narratives about is about academic achievement. Turning to academic achievement as a way of earning respect by proving their capabilities, and very often in the context of teachers who are underestimating their academic abilities. So this is a quote from Emily, a grade 12 student at the time in a Surrey high school. And she says, she's talking about her and 3 other girls that she knows in her high school who have been facing the same thing. She says, we're about 4 Africans, we're in grade 12, but unfortunately, we'll graduate, but we'll not have an academic diploma that from grade 8 we've been asking them to give us, like those courses that will take us to college or university, but they refused. Just give it to us, we believe we can do it, but they keep on saying, no you can't, no you can't. Many of the girls that we've talked to have developed alternative strategies, which predominantly includes going back to adult education as soon as they graduate, picking up the courses they need, and then going on to college. By turning to education as a route for respect and fitting in the larger society, the second generation daughters then are modeling norms of femininity that are at the same time further away from African American discourses about black femininity and African American youth culture and its points of resistance, because it doesn't provide them with one, and at the same time closer to their parents' sets of assumptions about what they might where they might go and what they might be thinking about for the future. So just to conclude then, and as I say, we're very much in the middle of this, so this might change. Young African Canadians, adolescents of both genders, encounter oppressive racialized scripts about masculinity and femininity, linked to the close proximity we have to the United States and the predominance of these discourses about African Americans. About, I don't mean by, I mean about. And certainly there's other points of resistance, but they're often the only one they're in connection with is youth culture. Racialized scripts which have to do with the proximity to a very large African American diaspora and its space within the U.S. and the discourses around that. That's antithetical to any kind of assumptions that the local African diaspora would have. Young men are drawn more to African American youth culture as they negotiate masculinity in the quest for respect among boys, partly because unlike their sisters, they often experience very intense racialized surveillance by authorities and others that reinforces those similarities, and because the images and the representations have some popularity in the wider peer group of young boys as well. The sons of African immigrants then, often, in adolescence at least, develop a stronger resonance with the oppositional stance of African American youth culture and conceive of themselves as part of a larger black diaspora. So Ibrahim's definition at the beginning around blackness seems to resonate more with those young men. Hence further removed from their father's notions of what is respectable African masculinity, which is something a bit different. For some young men, of course, this appears to be transitory as we're now interviewing, or I'm now interviewing, adults in their 20s up to about 33. This is often a transitory identity, particularly for African Canadian men who go on to post-secondary education and then redefine themselves yet again, and reimagine themselves often in ways that seem more similar to what their sisters are doing at 15 and 16 years of age. But for others, it does appear to be more long-term in terms of never finding that footing to disidentify with what's going on in the US. Their sisters, though, even in adolescence, experience racism differently, and there's much less appealing for them in representations that come out of a very male-centered African-American youth culture. So they're more likely to identify with and maintain strong links with the local African community even when they're teenagers, and reject analogies to African-American experiences even when they're teenagers. So that's what I'm finding so far, and I really welcome any comments, questions that you might have. Thank you.
Any questions? If I may start the conversation after Grace. This is my question to you. How does class work into your analysis of the construction of identity? Because I was 17 when I immigrated to the United States, right after the taking over of the American embassy. And by looking at my own life, although we were also racialized, called, terrorists out of the United States or whatnot. But I noticed that my class background as a middle-class male actually affected the way that I negotiated my racialization. So I was wondering if you could reflect on the class backgrounds of male and female Black Africans, and whether or not that has a consequence for their negotiation of their identities.
That's an excellent question. My short answer is I don't know yet. But my longer answer is, that's such a complicated question, because what do we, in this context, what do we even mean by class? Are we talking about the class backgrounds of their parents before they came, which are almost always very highly educated? Or are we talking about the context in which they live in here, which is very often in considerable poverty? So, and I think that matters. Both of those things matter in terms of what happens. I don't know that we're getting different class dynamics amongst the young women and the young men. I think we are getting different class positions for both, in the sense that there will be some young men whose families don't have the same resources, even though they might be well educated in their home countries, but don't have the same resources by the time they get up to senior high school, and they can't help them go on. And that may make a huge difference in terms of who goes on and who doesn't. I don't think it explains the gender differences, but I think it's really important for which of the young men reimagine themselves, go on to post-secondary education and reimagine themselves, and which maybe don't. And how much is that connected to class? And I would guess it very likely is, but I think it's probably complex.
Thank you.
My question is about hair, although I'm hairless. You mentioned that black male adolescents or youth tend to gravitate towards African American popular culture. What about the females don't do that? But what about those African or black females who try to be the Beyoncé lookalikes by trying to straighten their hair, yes, among other things?
Yes. Also, is this working? It's not working anymore. Also, a really good question. And yes, that's another way of trying to emulate those representations, isn't it? But and I think maybe it's even more complicated because it's not emulating the representations of African American women, or instead it's emulating the representations of mainstream culture, which is whiteness. And yes, women talk about that. Their hair, they talk about their hair a lot in terms of how they now wear it, how they used to wear it, what they had done to it in the past, and the fact that people will come up and touch their hair. Just people they don't know, people, I mean, just kind of mind-boggling as someone who hasn't experienced that. But yeah, I think the beauty norms are where the young women are going as adolescents. And again, I think they reimagine themselves when they're older. Because I think adolescence is a difficult time for everybody. And by the time you're 19, 20, you have to have a stronger sense of self to then reimagine where you end up. And yes, I suppose you're right that the Beyoncés, for example, are part of African American youth culture too. So that is what some black women do to follow that. But it's the rest of the representations that they're rejecting, particularly that kind of really hypersexualized representation.
I'll be running out. I used to be track, so that's fine.
Throughout your research, did you find, or did you ask youth, are they aware of the stigmas and the perceptions that the society has upon themselves? And if the answer is yes, did you find are the youth happy generally with the way their life is, and do they feel optimistic about the future? So 3 questions. Sorry.
Again, can I do this without the mic? I don't know.
I think people out there might not be able to hear you.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I got all of the question, but yes, I think youth are very aware of the kind of negative representations because people are really in their face often about those representations without even thinking about it. Somebody just sent me a very funny video, I have to say, called, excuse my language, "Shit White Girls Say to Black Girls." It's hilarious because it's a black woman wearing a blonde wig, and the things that she says, which have been sent to her, are quite extraordinary. So yes, they're completely aware of it. Are they optimistic? I think a lot of the youth we did focus groups were quite optimistic. They were very driven. And they knew that they had to be really strong, and they had to stay away from, you know, what a lot of them talked about, the bad stuff, you know, the partying and that kind of thing, in order to work hard and get somewhere. So they were, for the most part, very aware of what their parents had lived through to bring them to where they are today. So yes, but I think they're much less optimistic than young adults that we talk to, who are, so far at least, I think we've interviewed 30 now, really quite optimistic. And so if my original question was, well, the parents all said they did it for their kids, was it worth it? The answer would seem to be that in many respects, yes. But that doesn't mean there's not all this other stuff that's being negotiated. Hi.
I was just wondering, as a white female, where did your interest in this topic come from, and how did you build a rapport with your participants?
That is an excellent methodological question. I was doing work with diverse immigrant groups, and I've done a lot of my own volunteer work, working with groups like Mosaic, for example, because I've worked on immigration for a long time. So out of a 5-year study where we interviewed particular families once a year for 5 years, I got to know one family particularly well. And she kept saying to me, "You've got to study African women." So at a later time, she and I worked together. So the first book that I did, The New African Diaspora in Vancouver, I did with 2 researchers who are part of the African community, and I didn't do any of those interviews. We decided that they would do the interviews and then work through what sense we could make of them. But in the meantime, I've just been really involved with the community. I work with the Moja, which is down here. I'm on the board. I'm actually the president of the board, have been for a number of years. And that's how the work with the teenagers came about as a collective project with the Moja that I did. And then this project now, I've again recruited an RA who has a background from one African country, and another RA who doesn't. And I'm doing the interviews, and it would be well, I'm doing most of the interviews. My RA is doing some of the interviews, so it will be really interesting to look and see what kind of difference that makes, because as you may know, there's all kinds of research that shows that being an insider can be both positive and negative, and being an outsider has positive and negative. So it will be different. And I think almost every person I've interviewed in the second generation has asked me why I'm doing this. So I bring my book and say, I've been doing this kind of research, and these are the questions that come out of it. Yeah, it is about building both interest and knowledge. It's something, when I took on the first project, I had real trepidation about doing it as a white woman. That is an issue, but I also don't think that we should be navel-gazing. And so I think it's about doing work with communities, not for them, and not trying to speak for people. What I've done in all my research is use a lot of direct quotations. So to try to create context where people are speaking themselves. And I understand that I'm selecting what quotes, etc. So clearly there's an authorship issue there. But I'm trying as much as possible to speak with and alongside and not for particular groups. But you're right, it is an issue. It's also an issue when I'm interviewing young men about masculinity. And that, has its own dynamics, I'm sure, than women around issues of femininity. Yeah, really good question.
Thank you.
Hi, I have a question.
did you have an opportunity to analyze queer theory and intersectionally with your studies on identity? And if you have, what were your findings?
Again, a really good question. I can tell that this is a really good intersectional conference. I actually am asking questions about sexual identity in terms of heterosexuality and gay, lesbian, bi, trans, etc. I have to say that almost everybody I'm interviewing is identifying as heterosexual. It doesn't surprise me, because even if people don't identify, they mustn't even tell me. It's not a particularly safe environment. So the questions are there to see, and I think maybe a whole nother research project would need to be developed that would actually look at queer young adults specifically, because you need different points of entry to even access and find people. Some people have said, when I've asked these questions, yes, I do know, people who are gay, lesbian, whatever, but often not within the larger African community. So most people have talked about how this would be, it's particularly hard to come out, as it is in many immigrant communities, I think. So yeah, but yes, important questions, especially when you talk about negotiating masculinity and femininity. I mean, I didn't start out to think that's what I was doing. It's kind of come out of the research and how do I even explain these different sets of identifications. But yeah, no, it's very good.
Hi, I'm not sure if this is the same question that Amir asked you, but I'm just wondering, I noticed that there's different influences like migration, generation, racialization, gender, and identity. I'm just wondering, did you think of other influences? Like I'm thinking, what about like socioeconomic status or just economic status? Like a rich African-American person compared to a poor African-American person, or a middle class?
Yeah, I actually haven't encountered any rich, say, African Canadians. But yes, of course, it's an issue. And if we can continue to do research with the second generation as they get older, that will be an issue there too. What kinds of occupations do they end up in? Since a lot of people we're talking to are in their 20s now, that occupational trajectory, their education often isn't finished. You don't know where they're going to end up. For the parents, though, it has been a fairly low income community. Some certainly into the middle class, but not beyond the kind of entry level of the middle class, I would say. So, but that doesn't mean they didn't come from fairly privileged backgrounds before, which often is the case. So, yeah, it's to be determined. Yeah.
Maybe I can do it with that. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, super. Yeah, I'm not quite sure how to phrase this. It's not really a question, more a comment. But the African Canadian kids are identifying with representations in U.S. youth culture, and I think this is something that a lot of people in this room probably can identify with. They're not really identifying with African Canadian images. I just wondered if there were any images that they pointed out that were kind of speaking to them as African Canadians as opposed to these African Americans. Because I mean, obviously the images of African Americans and the situation of African Americans is very different from that of African Canadians. So I just wondered if there were any media, input or cultural, youth cultural input coming from, say, Africa that they were identifying with, or the Caribbean or somewhere else.
I think I actually really don't know the answer to that at all. Although certainly I think things like hip hop, which are being, there's a movement between Canadians and various African countries where there are Canadian hip hop artists, African Canadian hip hop artists that are moving back and forth between Somalia, between Uganda. I don't know where else because I'm definitely not an expert in this. But how much of that are 15-year-olds aware of? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Certainly, I think the 20-year-olds are aware of it. But are the youth that you know? That I don't know. Or what might it look like in another 10 years when there are more of those figures here?
I guess I'm thinking of, you know, the whole big Nollywood, the explosion of Nollywood video film.
Yeah.
You know, so people coming from West Africa probably have some familiarity with the stars, the celebrities in that whole Nollywood movement.
Yeah.
So I just wonder if there was that identification at all among the youth here.
Good question. No idea.
To answer your question, yes, there is a movement in, at least in West Africa, as far as I know, of fusing traditional music with hip-hop from the US. But even that is not authentically, you know, West African. It is being, you know, I mean, it's based upon an emulation of the popular African American popular culture. So that is not something that is going to influence them in a way towards authentically an African type of culture. It is the same second or diluted type of, you know, African culture. So that is what I can say to the question. And then Nollywood, the movies from, you know, Nollywood are, you know, also not very authentic, but they also tend to emulate Western lifestyles, opulence, cars, and all that. So, you know, very little about traditional life in Africa.
I was just wondering if you had experience in your studies seeing how higher education from the parents would affect how youth identifies themselves, whether it be like traditional stereotypes that we see in the media or whether they go beyond that.
Most of the people that, if we're talking about adults now, most of the people that I'm interviewing, their parents were highly educated before they came here, but that education is usually not recognized. So some then retrain here in terms of higher education, but many don't because they can't afford to reach, or they do, you know, like a one-year program as opposed to a full bachelor's or that kind of thing. So I'm not even sure that we would have enough people to be able to kind of disaggregate, you know, who is highly educated here and whether that matters versus the education you had before people came. So I really don't know. I can say that the emphasis on education, you know, I mean, everyone I've ever spoken to, that's a huge, huge emphasis on education. So the youth are certainly getting that at home, no question, that emphasis on education. But why some go on and some don't, there's a real concern in the community about dropout rates. But we don't know what the dropout rates are because the ministry doesn't keep dropout rates. They don't record student data by anything other than first language. So for a large Punjabi community here, you can find out. Or for Cantonese or Mandarin speaking, for virtually anybody else you can. Philippine you can. You can ask another Tagalog, but you can't, with this community you can't because there is no common language.
Can I ask another question in regards to that? Are they more likely to conform to whiteness if they're highly educated versus uneducated?
You're talking about young adults?
Right. So their parents being educated.
Are they more likely to conform, say, to the African American images if their parents are not highly educated?
Yes.
I don't know that. I think they're more likely to conform if they're not highly educated for the young men. That's my sense. Again, I'm not positive about that, but that's what I think we're seeing. But I don't know if we can relate that back to their parents' education. I think it's not, but I'm not positive.
Unfortunately, we have to stop here because the next sessions are going to be around 2:10. Hold on a second, please. Don't go anywhere.
Now, we do have Professor Kwantlen, who's going to present our keynote speaker with a small token of our appreciation.
Dr. Cresse. It was an honor to have such a distinguished scholar amongst us and talking and speaking about your recent research at Kwantlen Polytechnic University on behalf of the Department of Sociology, as well as Kwantlen University College, as well as the conference committee. We thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, now if everyone can just head off for our next sessions, they're in the same classrooms before.